From beautiful downtown Sacramento, it's time for Beach Blanket Fort Bingo.
Beach Blanket Fort Bingo. Beach Blanket, Beach Blanket Fort Bingo, Fort Bingo. Spazzy's got a show when you really want to know what's going on. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Beach Blanket, Beach Blanket Fort Bingo, Fort Bingo. Art and music golden blue and your favorite comics too. Grab a spot and settle in, 'cause it's high time we begin. Beach Blanket Fort Bingo Podcast. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Hello, everybody. My name is Steve Schnee, and welcome to Beach Blanket Fort Bingo. We've got a great show today, but before I introduce our very special guest, I'd first like to introduce my co-host. This is a guy who has a whole lot of heart. He loves his girlfriend. He loves his friends. He loves listening to music. He loves playing music. He loves his Jim Boy's tacos, and he loves you. In fact, this guy has so much heart that we call him Dreamboat Ronnie. Ladies and gentlemen, Ronnie Barnett.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks. It's good to be here. That sums me up well. Thank you.
Now, our very special guest today is a music industry veteran. From his days as a Decca music production assistant in the 60s to his time spent with British vocal group Design and beyond, this man has done it all, seen it all, and heard it all. And now, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of Design's debut album, he's here to share his story. It is my great privilege to introduce Barry Johnston. Welcome to the Blanket Fort, Barry.
Hi, Steve. See you. And Ronnie. Hi.
Now, before we talk about Design, let's go all the way back to the beginning. What inspired you to pursue music? Was it a particular moment or a series of events?
The Beatles, really. I was 13 when Love Me Do came out, and I heard that and didn't really pay much attention to it. But when Please Please Me came out, I started thinking, hey, who are this group? And then the next single was From Me to You, and from then on, I was hooked. And I bought all their records, I listened to everything, and I became obsessed like everybody else with the Beatles. And I already was then playing the guitar, but I suddenly thought, this is what I want to do. I want to be a writer who sings their own songs in a band. And I'm afraid my academic career went out the window when I should have been studying. I was playing guitar and learning all the new songs, and that was it from then on.
Did you grow your hair out too, Barry, at that point?
Well, I'm afraid no. I went to a school called Eton College, which you may have heard of, which is sort of the top private school in the UK. And unfortunately, if your hair touched your ears, you were taken off and told to get it cut. So no, I wasn't allowed to grow my hair at all, which was, I would go back to London in the holidays and the vacations and see everybody walking around with these fantastic haircuts, and I wasn't able to do that. So I was very upset.
Well, your early forays into the music business involve time spent as a production assistant at Decca Recording Studios. Can you tell us about that time?
Yeah, I was fortunate, clever enough, I think, to take my final exams at school a year early. So I left at the age of 17.
Walk on down the colored path. See your face go like yours. Hey, you dropped your smile.
I managed to get an interview with Decca Records. Their studios were just up the road from us, where we lived in St. John's Wood in London. And so I had to go for an interview at their head office with a man called Dick Rowe, who may ring a bell. He was the head of A&R at Decca then. He was the man who turned down the Beatles.
Yes.
Until Brian Epstein.
That's why we know his name.
Yeah. He said, groups with guitars are on the way out, he said. But anyway, I had an interview with him, and he said, "You're lucky because we've just got a vacancy for a production assistant at Decca Studios." The previous guy who was doing it was called Tony Clark, who went on to produce Moody Blues. So it wasn't a bad position to start. And what it meant was, I had a little office there, and I had to go into the studios every day and get all the production details of all the tracks. So I had to be there in the control room for every session, getting the timings of each track, the name of the artist, the titles, the producers, the publishers, and all that. So that, and I then had to file all that away and be responsible for filing the masters away. So when it came to release them, they would call down from head office and say, right, we want this track on that tape, and send through the details. So it meant I was there for every session. And I was just 17. And the first guy that came in was this unknown guy called David Bowie, doing his first album. And I'd actually seen him because he used to be Davy Jones and the Lower Third when he was in his mod band. Anyway, he came in and he was doing these really odd songs. He was very influenced by Anthony Newley, who was very big at the time, sort of, musicals and songwriter guy. And so they were very English, very kind of almost Cockney songs. Each track was really about a different character. And we were there for a couple of months doing this album. And no one really thought that it was going to be a hit. I thought it was interesting, though, because he had this aura about him even then. Very good looking, very cool. And there were several girls that worked at the studios, and they started coming into the control room for finding excuses to come in and just see how things were going on, you know. And so he had this attraction even then. But the album came out and died a death. I mean, it sold almost nothing. We never expected he'd go on to be huge superstar that he would be.
I wish that you'd speak some more. For now that I'm feeling reassured, my eyes are closing. I'm afraid of losing you. Children of the mist, I want you here.
Well, didn't you have something to do also with Cat Stevens?
Yes, well, he was the next one to come in. I mean, he was doing his first album as well. I mean, both these guys, they were both just 19 then. And so Cat Stevens came in, and he just had a single out called I Love My Dog. And so they'd asked for an album, and he was being produced by Mike Hurst. Yeah, that was a different one altogether, because he was doing his with a big orchestra. But the songs were really catchy, and one of them was called Matthew and Son, which was the first release, which came on to be a huge hit, and then he just took off. But it was just great being there in the studios, and the most amazing people would come in. Marianne Faithfull was doing her latest album then, called Love in a Mist. And one day I was sitting there, and her boyfriend at the time was Mick Jagger. And suddenly the studio door opened, and Mick Jagger came in to see how the session was going with Paul McCartney. So there I was in this little control room at Decca Studios with Mick Jagger, Paul McCartney, Marianne Faithfull, Donovan on guitar. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. You know, but it was like, this is unbelievable.
And you're 17. You're still 17.
I was 17 and a half.
Yeah.
Just left school.
Was there at any point, was there like interaction between any of you, or did they just sort of, oh, he's just a production assistant?
Well, yeah, pretty much. I was, you know, the guy sitting in the corner. I mean, they'd say hi, and you know, some people acknowledged you more. David Bowie, I didn't get to know very well. Cat Stevens was very friendly. He was sort of more alike. So when I left there and went to work for Mike Hurst, his manager, Cat Stevens then was beginning to look for other people to produce, and we had a mutual girlfriend. Who set up a meeting, and she told him, I've got this great guy who's writing songs, and you know, I think you should see him. And so we met in her flat. And I remember when he came in, he looked at me and said, oh my God, it's you. But he was very good. And I sat down and played him some of the songs that I've been writing then. And they were very simple songs. They're mainly just verse, chorus. And he said, no, I'll tell you what, you want to write a hit. And he actually sat down with me and he said, look, played a couple of his new songs and said, this is what you should do. You need to have a bridge here, and you need to have a middle eight. and it really showed me how to write a song properly, which was fantastic. You didn't have to do that, and it really helped.
Were you inspired to write songs by being around all the musicians in the studio, or were you already writing before you got that job?
I started writing at school, so I was listening very much to the Beatles, but being a solo guy with an acoustic guitar, I listened to a lot to Dylan, but I thought I can't sing like Dylan with my accent. And then when Donovan came along, I thought, now I can sound like him and I can play like him because his songs are very simple. And so I learned all Donovan's songs and found that was an easy way of writing. And so he was my first influence, really. And when I was playing stuff to Cat Stevens, that they were very much that sort of folky, slightly mystical songs that Donovan was writing at the time, and not very poppy, perhaps, but that was where I started off.
There's only one shadow along the beach. Instead of two, 'cause you're out of reach.
Now you have
You eventually got a publishing deal with Apple Publishing. How did that come about?
Well, as you did in those days, I used to take my guitar with me everywhere. And at the end of 1967, I was playing at a Christmas party somewhere. And this guy came up to me and said, I like your songs. And he handed me his telephone number and said, give me a call. And it turned out his name was Mike Berry. And he'd just been appointed as the talent scout for Apple Publishing, which the Beatles had just started.
Yeah.
And they'd signed a couple of groups already. I think they'd signed the Ivies. But I think I was the first solo songwriter that actually signed to Apple Publishing. And I couldn't believe it. I mean, I was just 18 then. I was so young, my mother had to sign the contract for me.
How many songs did you end up submitting or penning? Because I don't know how publishing goes, Ronnie might, but did you just spend days and days submitting songs?
Well, I had a whole bunch to start with. So, I mean, I went in, with a load of songs, and they picked half a dozen, and I went in and did some demos. They had their offices then were at 94 Baker Street, which was above the Beatles shop. They had this famous shop which they opened, and they had this huge mural, on the psychedelic mural on the wall outside. And their offices were behind that, and up on the top floor, they just got this tiny little room with 2 Revox tape recorders in it. And went up there and recorded half a dozen songs, and they listened to them and said, yeah, that's fine, we got any more? And I went away and wrote some more. So I went in 2 or 3 times every 2 or 3 months and recorded another batch of songs. But I never heard anything more about them. And in fact, the whole place was complete chaos. Nobody knew what they were doing. None of them, apart from Mike Berry, who did have publishing experience, they were all just friends of the Beatles.
Yeah.
And so they didn't know what to do. And after 6 months, I went in there to do some more demos, and everyone had gone. They'd all got the sack. And they moved everything to another office to try and salvage what was left of it. So the whole thing was a complete mess, and they never recorded any of my songs.
Since this is the internet, everybody loves a good Beatles or Beatles related story. Do you have anything to share?
Well, to do with the Beatles, I mean, Paul McCartney, I met 2 or 3 times. I mean, he actually came to live with in 1965. We lived in Cavendish Avenue, which is round the corner from Abbey Road, and he bought the house opposite.
Wow.
We were number 1A, and he bought number 7, which was just diagonally across the road. And this was at the time of Help. Yeah. He was one of the biggest stars in the world, and suddenly he moved in. And so suddenly, from being a very quiet little street, We had all these girls hanging around outside, and it was a very exciting time. You know, again, couldn't believe it. A Beatle was living opposite you. But he hardly ever came out because there were so many people there. And we worked out in the end that he would wait until it got dark and all these girls had gone home to have their tea or whatever. And he would come out then. You'd see him coming out in he had a Mini, and he was living with Jane Asher then at the time. And they'd go off to wherever they were going. And so he kind of, I think, slept during the day and came out at night so that he wasn't bothered. But that was the first time that I sort of came in close contact with him. After that, when we were signed to EMI, well, I'm moving on a bit now. We were up in Sheffield when Wings were on tour. We were doing some cabaret when I was in design at one of the clubs in Sheffield, and they were playing at the big city hall. And we thought, well, we'll just go along and see if we can get in. We'd recorded a couple of Beatles songs. We'd recorded Strawberry Fields Forever and Man We Was Lonely of McCartney's first album. And so we went in and said, you know, hi, we're design, and we recorded one of McCartney's songs. Anyway, message came back from McCartney, yeah, come in and watch. And so we went in and we sat there all doing the sound check for this Wings tour. They'd only just done a couple of gigs, so they were still rehearsing it. And the main song they were rehearsing was Live and Let Die, which had just come out then. So fantastic to see them doing the sound check for that, you know, still trying to work out how to play it on stage with Linda on keyboards and all that. So, I mean, that was great. And the final time that we saw him was actually at Abbey Road, our last album. We recorded in the Beatles studio, number 2 studio. And we were just doing some overdubs, doing some vocals. And we didn't realize that Wings were next in the studio. And so Paul and Linda came in and sat down at the back of the studio and said, hi, design, you know, so, hi, Paul. And you know, I was doing these overdubs, and I was thinking, oh my God, Paul McCartney is listening to me singing. Oh my God, Paul McCartney is listening to me singing. But apart from saying hello and goodbye, I'm afraid that's really all the conversation we had. But it was great to be in close contact with him.
Now you realize that most people can say like, oh, I lived, you know, halfway across the world from a Beatle, but you lived across the street, which is, you know, pretty mind-blowing.
It was amazing at the time. I mean, you know, I was a teenager, and you know, to have him moving opposite, it was just unbelievable. Yeah.
Then in the summer we go walking through the country. Lonely trees would sing your name. The wind would shake its head, saying no, and I couldn't understand it. Now I'm older, I know the game.
Being a singer and songwriter, how did you come to join Design, which was a vocal group? Because instead of being like the focal point, you were going to be one of 6.
Well, it was because I was at Apple, and there was this guy called Tony Smith, who was a songwriter, and he worked for the BBC in what they called their gramophone library, which was their record collection. I think it was supposed to be the biggest collection of records and 78s in the world at the time. That they reckoned that, you know, you could put in a request to the BBC to listen to a record, and within 10 minutes they would have found it, and it was like the British Library kind of thing. Anyway, he worked there, and he was wanting to do some demos of his songs, and a radio producer called Alec Reed said, look, if you hang on and wait till the studios are closed at the end of the day, we can get into an empty studio, and I'll record the demos for you. And John was working with a guy called John Malkai Morgan, who worked in the gramophone library with him. He was in a semi-pro band, played the drums. He said, well, I'll come along and help. He brought his friend Jeff, who was the singer in the band. And Alec Reed, the producer, brought these 2 girls in, Gabrielle and Kathy, who Gabrielle he'd worked with before, and Kathy was her friend. And they just sang harmonies on these demos, and it sounded so good. It was almost like an old 60s movie. At the end of it, said, hey, fellas, you know, why don't we form a band? And that was at the end of December 1968. And about 2 weeks later, he rang me because he knew my sister, and he'd heard I was with Apple. And I think he was hoping that, you know, I might be able to pull some strings and, get him to meet the Beatles or something. And he said, will you come along and listen to this new group I'm putting together? And I went along, and as soon as I heard them, I thought, this is really different. The sound with the two girls on these high sopranos and so on. And I've always loved singing in choirs. I sang in a choir at school. I was the leader of a choir at school. And I started singing along with them. And within a couple of weeks, Tony said, well, why don't you join the group? And I thought, well, actually, this is a great way of getting my songs recorded. I love singing harmony. They're a great bunch of kids. And so I said, yeah. And so I joined straight away.
I was going to say, were you looking to join a group, Barry?
No, not
Or
at
did you
all.
think you'd be a solo? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, no, I thought I was going to be the next Donovan.
Right.
Were there other vocal groups at the time that sort of influenced the band, or that you were sort of fashioning yourselves after?
Well, the big ones obviously were the Mamas and Papas, who split up by then, but they were the template if you were going to form a vocal harmony group at that time, and the Fifth Dimension, who just got started. And so they obviously the two big American influences. There weren't really any British groups like that. And so we were thinking, right, we were coming from a folk background. Tony was writing folk songs. I was writing folk influenced songs.
Yeah.
The girls had classical training, so they were singing these sort of high soprano voices. And the two boys had been in this semi-pro rock band. And so it was like trying to combine all these influences to create a new sort of British vocal group sound, and also with an influence from Tony, who'd grown up in France. And there was a group called the Swingle Singers, who were a French vocal group who sang a cappella and did all the different parts of all the instruments. And so it was kind of combining that, and it was really just 6 voices, 2 girls and 4 boys, and at the start with just Tony on guitar or me on guitar, and really filling in all the parts with the voices. And that was the idea, and that's how we started working out the harmonies to start with.
And the people just wandering around, and the people just wandering around,
Did the record deal come pretty quick thereafter?
Instantly. It was the whole thing was ridiculous. I mean, I suppose things happened fast in those days. I joined the group in February 1969. In March, we did an audition for Adrian Kerridge, who was the boss of Lansdowne Studios, which is one of the big independent studios at the time. He'd been one of the engineers and co-producers on Dave Clark's first couple of records, Glad All Over and Bits and Pieces and so on. So he knew what he was doing. He heard us and said, come down to Lansdowne and do some demos, which we did a couple of weeks later. And he signed us up on the spot. So within 6 weeks of me joining the group, we had a record deal. It was ridiculous.
While many have referred to, and I think you have as well, referred to Design as a sunshine pop band, I think the songs and the arrangements reveal that Design was much more than that, because the as you've mentioned, the voices sometimes are almost choral-like, and also drawn from British folk influences, and the songwriting and the arrangements are just far more sophisticated than your average pop tune. Did you think of yourselves as a sunshine pop, which I don't even know if that even existed?
Yeah, sunshine pop didn't exist. It wasn't a word. I mean, I think sunshine pop didn't come out as a phrase until probably the 90s.
Yeah.
Before then, it was just pop music. But we were trying to sound different from the Americans, but also, it was trying to be more of a choral sound, deliberately trying to make it that the voices playing the parts of the instruments. As I said, the girls would sing the high bits in the background, almost like the strings, and we'd fill in the gaps. And we didn't see ourselves really as a pop group. We weren't a group going out to sing pop songs and trying to get a hit. We saw ourselves as an album group, and putting together this collection of songs, which were all written by Tony, apart from a couple by me. and Tony did all the arrangements. It was very much his brainchild. These were all his ideas. And to start with, we just went along with it, learning as we went.
Right. You didn't perform live until after the
No,
record, I'm guessing. Yeah.
we sang at parties and things like that, but we recorded our first album in all through 1969 without ever having done a professional gig. And then the single came out the following year, and we still hadn't been on stage. I mean, it's ridiculous. We were a studio band, and so we appeared on television for the first time without ever having performed in front of a proper audience, and it was a bit of a wake-up call for us. Yeah.
Right. You had to figure out what image you were going to have, I would imagine. You know, six singers. Like, what are you going to wear? You know.
Well, yeah. Well, we had no money, so I mean, if you look at some of the early pictures, you know, we're pretty scruffily dressed, and we had long hair, and we were growing beards, and we really saw ourselves more. Yeah. That's after we'd been given haircuts and cleaned up a bit, but no, we saw ourselves as more as a folk group, and so the fact that we grew beards, we weren't trying to be pop stars, but of course, once you've got a record deal, you start going through the publicity machine, and you know they want you to start, you know, looking more like a pop group and trying to shape you. And that's when things began to change a bit, really, and we started to change because of the commercial pressures from the record company, and then the TV companies that wanted us to, you know, look more presentable.
And I find that people annoy me when I am thinking about the thoughts you were thinking, singing in my head, singing in my head, dreaming with her, feeling on my hands, a soft brown hair. Is it?
Design came together around the same time as the Beatles were breaking up. Rock music was going in a heavier direction, you know, both sonically and lyrically. Did you feel, you know, by the time you guys were ready to release the album, did you feel sort of out of place because the scene was just progressing so quickly?
Yeah, we were about 2 years too late, I think. The thing is, we recorded the album in, as I say, in 1969. But it didn't come out until March 1971, by which time some of those tracks were a year and a half old.
Yeah.
And the music scene had changed completely. I mean, what happened, unfortunately, was we signed with Epic in the States. Once the album was finished, our production company went to New York. This guy, Sid Dale, who was Adrian Kerridge's partner, went to New York because he had very good publishing contacts over there, and got us a deal with Epic Records in New York. I think we were one of the first British groups to actually sign direct to an American label, and they were expecting us to go over there, but we had no money. We managed ourselves. We didn't even have a manager, and so they were waiting for us to go over there before they'd release the album. And time went by, and by the end of 1970, they still hadn't released it. And by that time, Tony had left the group. He got very ill. The pressure of being the songwriter and the singer and the arranger and the organizer of the group and everything else got to him, especially once he had to start writing the second album, and he was drinking too much, and he got a hernia and an ulcer and ended up in hospital. So he had to leave for his health. So, you know, by the time the album came out, the lead singer and the songwriter wasn't even in the group. And so if it had come out a year earlier, I think we'd been all right. But by 1971, the whole music scene had changed. You know, in the UK, it was T-Rex and Slade, and you know, it had become all glitter, and Bowie was coming along, and we were singing all these, you know, lovely choral harmonies, and really we were like from a whole different world at that time.
Since we're talking about Epic Records, I just want to ask about the alternate cover.
Oh,
yeah. Epic chose not to show the beards.
Oh, we cried. We didn't know anything about that. So, but by the end of 1970, the albums hadn't been. Yeah, look at that.
Yeah.
somebody got a
What does it mean,
tractor.
Barry? What does this
Yeah, he's
mean?
done doodles on the back.
Barry
yeah,
has his own copy.
I do, yes. You can see I got it from a cutout.
Oh yeah,
book.
you got a free one. Yeah.
Yours is better than mine. But so we got desperate in the end and called up New York, the boss in New York, and said, please, will you release this? Because Epic in the UK will not release the album in the UK until you've released it in the States first. And so he said, okay. And they released it, I think, in January in the US. And the first we saw of that cover was when CBS in London said, oh, we've got the cover, and showed us this thing. And literally the girls burst into tears. We'd had our own cover designed, and they'd done all this without consulting us. Well, that was the UK, yeah. So we had to get that one done instead. But they'd just gone ahead and they didn't know anything about the group. They didn't know who we were, or they never consulted us. And so we went to CBS in London and said, we refuse to let you release this cover. And they said, well, we're not paying for another one. And we said, well, how about if it's in black and white? And they said, okay, well, you can have a black and white cover because that's cheaper. And so we went and had this picture taken. There, now you can see the hair's a bit longer there. That's me. Believe it.
Nice.
And yeah, so we just went. They took us out in the woods on a freezing cold day, took that picture, and said, right, that's it. So that became the UK cover. But when it was released, it did get very good reviews. Everyone was saying this is unlike anything else that's around. And it was because of that we got a call from a program called the Morecambe and Wise Show, which was the big comedy show in the UK at the time. And if you were on that, then suddenly you were sort of instantly famous. And they asked us to go on there, but they wouldn't let us sing our own songs. In fact, the first one we did was Sunny by Bobby Hebb, which was part of the songs that we knew. And then the next one, they asked us back again, and we wanted to do the Jet song, which was our next single. They said, no, you have to do a song that all the family know. How about Meeting on a Jet Plane? That's got a jet in it. and so we were in this real quandary as to what to do, because we wanted to do our own material. We were writing our own material. We were recording these albums, but to get on television, we had to sing other people's songs to start with anyway. And we thought, if we don't do that, because we're not doing live gigs, we're never going to get any publicity. So we have to do the television. And then suddenly we found ourselves being sort of moved away from our original sound to make it more family friendly. But that was the price we had to pay to get on television and for people to see us. And actually, once we started doing television, the phone rang, and we did more than 50 TV shows over the next 5 years.
When the weekend's over and you're getting set to go, think about the things we talked of. Think about the things you know, and maybe you will change your mind. Still be there when I wake up. Tomorrow's forecast is cloudy, so the weatherman has said.
Before we talk about some of the songs on this, Tony wrote pretty much the whole album except for one track, which I will talk about in a few moments. But when you were brought in to the band, was it initially just to be a singer, or were they also going to be looking for your songwriting input? And this is before Tony left, obviously.
Yeah, no, Tony has told me, he revealed later. He said, one of the reasons he wanted me in the band was to have a second songwriter, to take some of the pressure off him. By that time, he had written most of the first album. So we did demo quite a few of my songs. Yeah, the first album was pretty much written. The second album was always going to feature much more of my songs anyway, even before he left. But yes, the idea was that in the end, we would split the songwriting between us, I think.
I love the sound of male vocal harmonizing, the Beach Boys, the Association, the Letterman, the Four Freshmen stuff. But there's a whole new dynamic when you add the female voice, because it brings more depth and emotion to the sound. Would you generally agree with that?
Absolutely. And Kathy and Gabrielle had been friends since they were about 3 years old. They lived a couple of streets away from each other. They went to the same schools right the way through. And so they were best friends. They'd always sung together. And so their voices blended perfectly. And from the word go, Kathy had a slightly more pure soprano voice, and Gabrielle's was a little more mellow. So when you combine the two of them, it just made this wonderful sound. I'm not comparing us with ABBA, but in the same way as the two girls in ABBA, when you put the two voices together, it creates this fantastic blend.
Yeah.
And certainly to start with, they were always on the top of the harmonies. It would tended to be sort of Tony at the bottom singing the lead. I'd be singing the third. Kind of our influence there was like the Everly Brothers or Simon and Garfunkel, this sort of close harmony between the two of us. Then the other two boys would come in around that, and the girls on top. And it created this really thick sound. Yeah.
When you would write songs, like in your mind, would you think about where you wanted harmonies and stuff? Or was it a situation where you brought the song to the studio and all the members provided, maybe input or suggestions and built the song from there?
Well, it was the latter. And in fact, I haven't mentioned, we all lived together. Once the group got together, when I joined them in February '69, we lived in different parts of London. And we would get together to do rehearsals, but we only had time. We had jobs during the day. We only had time to rehearse for a couple of hours in the evening. Then we had to get back to our own flats or wherever. And so we found this basement apartment in Earl's Court in London, in West London. And we all moved in there. By that time, Kathy had paired off with John, and Gabrielle had paired off with Jeff. So Tony and I were the two bachelors. And so we'd sit up all night writing songs and doing the arrangements. But every day we'd come back from work and sit around and spend the evening working out these songs. So Tony would say, right, here's my new song. And he would start off with a kind of basic arrangement. But as we got more used to it, then of course we'd all start pitching in our own ideas. And so certainly in my own case, I would write a song just as writing a song and then play it to the rest of the group. And I'd be amazed sometimes at the way things changed. I mean, the Minstrel's Theme is a case in point. The demo of it is on this, this new CD, which is just me singing it with an acoustic guitar. And thank you. And
plugging, plug.
Yeah. Once the others started adding bits to it, the song changed completely. And it became something that I never imagined when I wrote it. And it was the same with so many other songs on the other albums, songs which I had envisioned being, perhaps a gentle ballad. They'd say, no, we need to speed it up, and they'd turn it into something completely unexpected. So that was the joy of actually everyone putting in their own influences. Yeah.
And I would give my love for a single smile from the only child who makes my life worthwhile. Oh, my sweet Josephine.
Did you all eventually at some point just operate instinctually where everybody kind of knew what to add to a song?
After we've been together a couple of years, it was really instinctive, and we could arrange things very, very quickly because we all knew what each other could do. And so somebody would start off singing a harmony. What we really liked doing was not just singing straight harmonies, but having different melodies weaving in and out.
Yes.
And so we'd start off with the basic harmony, and then someone would say, you're right, we used to call them sort of crossovers, and say you get sort of a different melody going through, and then it created this wonderful patchwork of harmony.
Yeah, I think that the design sound is very, very unique. And I mean, one of the main reasons we're here is obviously to talk about the 50th anniversary release of the first design album. This album came out,
I've got one
Ron.
too.
Yeah. uh, Now, the album was originally released in 1971. We talked about some of the tracks. Willow Stream was a single, and Colored Mile was a single. Did you guys have any involvement in that kind of thing? Choosing what songs would be picked as singles?
Well, Willow Stream, yes. That was actually the very last track that went on the album. The album was finished
Hmm.
at the end of '69 and had been mastered and was all ready to go. And then Tony came up with this really simple song, Willow Stream, which is almost like a nursery rhyme in a way. And our producers said, "That's it, that's the single." And so we rushed straight into the studio and recorded that. That's actually got less harmonies on it than any other track on the album, actually, if you listen to it, because the other songs are very complicated, a lot of them. Tony liked to write songs that didn't really have verse chorus, but were kind of sound pieces that one bit would join up with another. Often it was like side 2 of Abbey Road, little snippets of songs which he'd join up together to create a soundscape. And so great to sing, really exciting to listen to, but not very catchy as a pop single. And so, but I think because of that, we never got a hit, because you need to be more focused, and rather than singing, well, let's take that track off and put it out as a single. Our big rivals at the time were the New Seekers, who started the same time as us, and they had very high-powered management, and they were picking the best songs from around the world, and like I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing, and these fantastic songs, and so they were totally focused on the next single, whereas we were just focused on the next album, and so it was a very different attitude. We were quite happy recording the album.
Every afternoon then we would meet. I'd kiss your hand and we would sit beneath the weeping willow tree. As love went on, then we were free.
When you started doing live shows, Barry, where were you working? Were you opening for people? Were you doing that kind of live performing, or were you on a cabaret circuit, or?
It ended up being cabaret. Yeah, the very first show we did on stage was a variety show with a guy called Rolf Harris, who was a big star at the time. And we opened the show for him. We did the first half, he did the second half. But once we started doing the Morecambe Wise shows, we started getting asked to do cabaret. And at that time, there was a big circuit of clubs in the north of England where you'd go and do a week's cabaret. And you could spend your, the whole year, if you wanted, going from one club to another. But we just were the wrong group for it. I mean, this was the only work that we could get. But we would go up there. We were wanting to sing like our album material or our more folky stuff. They wanted more upbeat songs they knew. So once again, we had to start singing other people's songs. But we did that for several years. And that was really what paid the bills. But we never enjoyed it very much. I don't think the audiences enjoyed it quite so much either. But that was where we learnt our trade of having to go on every night and doing an hour's cabaret, how to be on stage and how to perform. And so that helped us on TV as well. And within the space of 2 years, we were a very accomplished live act. We did go on tour as well. We did the first tour with Gilbert O'Sullivan. Wow. Who was huge at the time. He was top of the charts with Get Down, which was #1 in the UK. And this was after we'd been going a couple of years. So this is when we'd really got our act together. And we opened a show for him. And that was an eye-opener for us. He was a big teen idol. And the first show was in Dublin, where he was from. And we walked on stage to screams from the crowd. It was the first time we'd ever been screamed at. We didn't quite know what to do. And of course, they weren't screaming at us. They were just screaming at the fact that a group had come on stage. But
Yeah.
that was fantastic. So we toured all around the UK with Gilbert O'Sullivan and ended up at what was then called the Hammersmith Odeon, which is now the Apollo, which is sort of the big concert
Right.
venue in London. And that was a fantastic experience. And a couple of years later, we toured with the Hollies
Wow.
when they had a new album out, and when our final album came out, and we opened the show for them, and that ended up at the Royal Albert Hall, which was amazing to come out on stage, 6,000 people. So
Barry, what were you guys wearing on stage at this point of your career? The cabaret, these years. Are you wearing matching things or?
Yeah, we were. You imagine we didn't wear uniforms, but sort of color coordinated. The girls always had fantastic clothes. They would go down to Chelsea, to the King's Road in Chelsea, and get the very latest styles down there from the boutiques. And we would just go. We were just wearing whatever was in fashion, and deliberately not all dressed the same, but so it was coordinated. And it
bell bottoms. Did you wear bell bottoms, Barry?
Oh yes, yeah, we got some very big bell bottoms on. Yeah, they were all the style at one point.
Going back to this CD, everybody show your CD.
Oh,
all right, here we go. Yep.
Okay, going back to the CD, the bonus tracks are super interesting because many of them cover the various solo projects, and I think that listeners will be immediately drawn to You're Dancing Alone and the track by Tony, and I love the Design Orchestra's Never Been in Love Like This. I love that to death.
Oh, do you? Great.
Yes, but I'm not sure many of your original fans going back 50 years are going to quite know what to make of Internet Cafe Orchestra.
See the light, feel the light, become the light, become the light.
Where does that come from? Because now Ronnie and I, of course, we're the hip young guys, in our 40s and 50s or whatever. Where does that song come from?
Well, going back to why are these tracks on, really, when we decided to reissue this for the 50th anniversary, Gary Gillis, who owns Vacancy Records up in Scotland, who turned out to be a lifelong Design fan. He had all the original albums on vinyl. And he actually contacted me and said, I'd really like to put this first album out. But to make it special, we ought to try and bring in some other tracks. And I had some of these outtakes from the studio from the first album, which I'd kept. And he said, well, how about if we get a new track from each member of the group since they've left the group? And I said, well, I don't know if they've got any. And so I emailed everybody because I'm in touch with everyone. And Gabrielle had this song, which she'd done with her husband then, called Gypsy Lady. I had this song, Dancing Alone. John had a song that he'd done. And Kathy, her partner was Dave Goodman, who was the first engineer and producer with the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, right.
You couldn't get any further from Design. But,
Yeah.
but they formed various bands together doing sort of electronic ambient music.
Yeah.
Mainly instrumental music. And they'd done an album calling themselves the Internet Cafe Orchestra. And I had this CD and I played it, and I just loved this track called Become the Light. And they didn't do any vocals. So essentially, if I wanted a track by Kathy, it was going to have to be an instrumental. And this has got her voice on it, saying Become the Light and so on, and she's playing on it. So it sounds completely different from everybody else. But I thought, well, this is what Kathy has been doing. She still has been working as a musician all these years, but went off in a completely different direction, and it doesn't sound anything like Design. But I thought, well, that's who she is, so it ought to be on the album.
Oh, absolutely. Now, there's one thing that I did not ask you about. I'm going to show this here now. It is autographed by Barry Alexander. Now, how come you had to change your name in Design?
Because of equity, the Actors Union equity.
The
very first TV show we did for ITV television, a thing called the Golden Shot. In order to do that ITV program, we had to be members of Equity. We were already members of the Musicians Union, but Equity dealt with actors, but also these ITV programs. And they're very strict. And when I applied, we had 48 hours to join before we could do the TV show. And the word came back, sorry, we've already got a member called Barry Johnston. So you've got to change your name or else you can't be a member. And my father's second name is Alexander. And, you go through family names first. My first name's Charles. I thought, no, I'm not going to be Charles. And so I thought, Barry Alexander. Okay, Barry, that sounds fine. And it was a split-second decision, and I was stuck with it for the next 15 years.
Speak before I lose my mind. Lord, speak before I lose my mind.
Now, after 50 years, how do you feel about this album?
Delighted, actually. I mean, it's one of these strange things. When the group split up in 1976, we all went our separate ways. Gabrielle went to live in Australia. Kathy is in Malta. John's in New York. Tony lives in France. I live in the south of England, and Jeff, our guitarist, lives in London. And so we just didn't have any contact with each other for about 40 years until I started bringing these CDs out. And we've then got back together and we've stayed in touch ever since. But we didn't listen to the old music. We'd all moved on in our lives and thought, well, that's it. That's behind us. Everyone had forgotten about design. And my whole deal in bringing these CDs out was to remind people who design were. And listening to it again now, after 50 years, all the background to it, the fact that it came out 2 years after it should have done, or that we were on television doing all these comedy shows, that's all forgotten. People now just listen to the songs, and the songs are great, and it sounds great.
Absolutely.
And, we've got the most amazing reviews. There was a review in the Times newspaper, the London Times, a couple of weeks ago by the rock critic of the Times, giving it a 4-star review, saying, this is a lost gem, saying this is absolutely fantastic. He'd never heard of design before.
Right.
And we'd sent him this album and he said, this is amazing. Why haven't I heard of this before? I said, well, because it wasn't a hit, but people are discovering it now and saying, this is just wonderful, which was the whole idea of bringing it out again.
Is it nice going back and revisiting this wonderful legacy that you started building more than 50 years ago?
It's been a joy. It really has, actually. And I'm sort of reliving my youth. We never imagined back in 1971 that anyone would be talking about it. No one ever did, 50 years later.
Yeah.
And the fact that people are discovering us for the first time, all the rest of the group are just so thrilled that Gabrielle said to me the other day, it validates my life. She said, there was a whole part of my life, through her 20s that had been forgotten and no one ever talked about. And now people are listening to our music, watching the videos on YouTube, and our music lives again, and it's wonderful.
It's wonderful that you're all around to see this happen. It's fantastic.
Where can viewers keep updated on all things Barry Johnston, Barry Alexander, and design?
The simple thing, there's 2 things. There's the design website, which is designvocalgroup.com, and also design Facebook page, which is Design Vocal Group. And they've all got loads of videos, pages and pages of photographs. I put up stuff on the Facebook page every few days or so they can find out everything they want there.
Well, that's it for us here at Beach Blanket Fort Bingo. Ronnie and I would like to thank our special guest, Mr. Barry Johnston from the group Design, for stopping by the Blanket Fort and sharing his stories. Remember to check out the brand new 50th anniversary deluxe edition of the self-titled album, available on Vacancy Records. And thank you, Barry, for your time. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll see you next time on Beach Blanket Fort Bingo.
And I would give my world for a single smile from the only child who makes my life worthwhile.
Well, Barry, we got to ask you this. 50 years ago, you're in design, and you hear
Yeah.
about this band across the pond that's mining a similar kind of music called the Free Design. What are your thoughts at the time?
We never heard of them.
Okay.
Yeah, nobody in the UK ever heard of Free Design
Okay.
until 80s, 90s.
Yeah.
When Cherry Red Records brought out
Yeah.
a best of Free Design CD. And that
Mhm.
was the first time I ever heard of them.
I consider you guys the more expensive version since they're free.